Someone I want to see.
My friend Sherlock Holmes.
221B Baker Street.
Hello there. Welcome to my review of 1965's A Study in Terror, the second of my Sherlock Holmes film reviews as part of my Sherlock Holmes season. This is another original story. It features John Neville as Sherlock Holmes, relatively early on in his film career. Neville would go on to have a long and prolific career, although he is perhaps most well known for his performances in The Adventures of Baron Munchausen as the title character, and in The X-Files as one of the shadowy cabal of old white men controlling the world, known in that show as the Well-Manicured Man. He would also pop up in everything from Star Trek The Next Generation to The Fifth Element to Urban Legend. Playing Watson is Donald Houston, an equally prolific actor, although arguably more famous than Neville at the time this film was made. He would go on to appear in dozens more films, including Where Eagles Dare and Clash of the Titans, after this, and he was also Welsh. The unique angle for this story is that Holmes is on the trail of Jack the Ripper. Had Holmes been a real person, he would have been a contemporary of Jack the Ripper, and there have been theories that Arthur Conan Doyle may have been Jack, with his medical background and... well, that's about it really. He's famous and was in London around the time of the murders, but like most potential suspects, the evidence amounts to not much more than that. This was the first time this historical figure and the fictional detective were put together, but is a topic that has since been tackled a few times in film, novels, including the novella of this film by Ellery Queen, and even in video games. This is also the first appearance of Mycroft Holmes in film, played here by Robert Morley. So it really did set some important benchmarks. The film opens with a woman's footsteps on cobbles, closely followed by a man's. Before it's revealed, the woman is a prostitute who attempts to solicit the man, but he stabs her through the neck with a surgeon's knife.
Hello, darling. Like a bit of fun?
A crowd gathers as the credits roll, and it ends with the police removing the body. This sets an uneven tone for the film that is unsure whether it wants to be a Hammer horror or a Sherlock Holmes mystery. But one thing is clear: it does not want to be an accurate portrayal of the Ripper murders. The plot requires that all of his victims were prostitutes and goes a long way to establish this, with even Holmes making a deduction that they must have been prostitutes because they were out late at night. I think this is the first indication the writers don't quite get Holmes's method. There were many reasons a woman might be on the streets of London at night. Chief amongst those was the transient nature of the poor and destitute in Victorian London, living hand to mouth, and if they were able to afford lodgings, it might only be for one night at a time. It's now fairly well established that some of the victims were definitely not prostitutes, and it's inconclusive whether the others were. The problem here comes not with the victims in this story being prostitutes, as this is a fictionalized version of events, but that Holmes's deduction is not a deduction, it's an assumption, which is not in character for Holmes. This opening scene, however, does very little to set up the story other than demonstrate a killer is on the loose, which is reinforced in the next scene where basically the same thing happens, but with a far longer setup, as we cut to an East End pub where everyone is having a jolly old time as a singer entertains the crowd. I'm not sure if there's a rule that in all Sherlock Holmes pastiches and parodies you have to have a woman singing in a pub, but this is 2 for 2 as far as my reviews are concerned. As the crowd enjoys itself, a young woman, who also turns out to be a prostitute, pickpockets the man she is kissing, and is discovered when it's his turn to pay for the drinks. The man and his friend here are played by Jeremy Lloyd, who would go on to co-create Are You Being Served? And Corin Redgrave of the Redgrave acting dynasty in early roles. They retrieve the man's wallet in their own unique way before she is ejected by the landlord. A man follows the woman out of the pub, and the landlord also leaves shortly afterwards. Not long after this, she is murdered and left in a water trough. The intention here is to establish some of the characters and potential suspects we will encounter, and to show that 2 murders have been committed, but I don't think it's particularly successful at establishing which characters we might see again, giving no real prominence to any of them, and we don't need to know that 2 murders have been committed, because in the very next scene we learn that 2 murders have been committed.
There was an identical murder of a woman in Whitechapel just 3 days ago.
Ah, a second murder.
I feel a stronger opening would have been not to have seen the first 2 murders, and to go straight to Watson reading about the latest murder, only for Holmes to deduce it was connected to the seemingly unrelated earlier murder, Holmes being the only one so far to have made this connection. I also think Neville plays Holmes a little too dispassionately. While the puzzle is usually the most important thing to Holmes, he does still care about the victims, and in this case would surely care a great deal, but remains almost gleeful in his deductive capabilities. I also think it would have worked better had Holmes not chosen to investigate at this time, as a maniac murdering seemingly at random is not the sort of case he would investigate, and certainly not without being asked to. It's particularly confusing as the next time the pair are in Baker Street, Holmes receives a parcel of surgical equipment from a mystery figure which would have acted as the perfect catalyst for his involvement. Before that, though, we get our 3rd murder, as we see a young Barbara Windsor as Annie Chapman being thrown out of her home. She spots an old friend, Kathy, who we saw in the pub scene, and asks her for money, which she is denied. She then goes to see her friend, Chunky, and is again turned down as she leaves. As she leaves, she is finally grabbed by the Ripper and becomes his next victim. As a result of Holmes's inspection of the parcel of surgical equipment, he and Watson visit the Duke of Shires, who informs them the case belongs to his son Michael, who he has disowned for pursuing honest work rather than live off his inheritance, which is honestly the most real moment in the entire film. We also meet the Duke's other son, Edward, Lord Carfax, played by John Fraser. Edward is a little more becoming with information, and says he hasn't seen Michael for 2 years. This forms the subplot of the film, as Holmes also investigates Michael's disappearance, and the potential that he is the Ripper. They then go to the pawnbroker who previously held the case of instruments, and he happens to be the man who left the pub in the opening scene, seemingly following Polly Nichols, giving us another potential suspect. It's really nice to see Holmes not wearing the deerstalker and cape in these early scenes, as they were never a regular feature of his attire in the original stories, and only much later became his default costume. Unfortunately, the film does revert to this stereotype later on in the story, but it's refreshing to see him not in that outfit from the beginning. The pawnbroker is able to provide them the name of the seller, that of Angela Osborne, the same surname as the Duke of Shires, and that the address was given as Dr. Murray's soup kitchen and mission hospital. As they're on their way to the morgue, they bump into Inspector Lestrade, who is investigating the murders, and Holmes convinces him to allow them to help. The pathologist conducting the autopsy is none other than Dr. Murray, played by Anthony Quayle, whose soup kitchen is next door to the morgue, giving us yet another potential suspect. As we enter the midpoint of the film, it seems to feel far more comfortable than it did in the relatively messy beginning. The mystery and Holmes's involvement takes a long time to set up and get moving, with many early scenes being repetitive and patchy as they try to introduce a few too many characters that don't really go anywhere. From the scene with the Duke onwards, the introduction of characters feels far more natural, and I think the film might have flowed better had they found a better way to get Holmes into the story. Holmes tells Watson he is to visit Murray's Mission Hospital and ask for Angela Osborne, create a scene when he's told she's not there, then leave. We then meet Sally, played by a young Judi Dench, as she leads the various homeless people at the mission in song, just as Watson arrives. He's greeted by a homeless man who tells him he needs to sing for his supper. He is encouraged to join in, even if he doesn't know the words. I'm pretty sure this is a joke, as the hymn they sing is a famous Welsh song that Houston would certainly have known.
You have to sing for your supper here.
While Houston gives it his best, there seems to be a certain amount of confusion as to what his character is, as he is halfway between the capable and fearless Watson of the original stories and the bumbling idiot played by Nigel Bruce in the Basil Rathbone films. They never quite seem to know which Watson they want, and as a result Houston is left playing both versions from one moment to the next. I really would have preferred to see the competent version, as it's in these moments that Houston really seems to shine. Watson creates his scene as instructed, and when he leaves, so does Dench's Sally, followed by the homeless man Watson was speaking to. He follows her into a house where Lord Carfax is waiting, and reveals himself to be Sherlock Holmes in disguise. It's not a bad disguise, and he's helped by having someone in the scene in the mission who looks a bit like John Neville, just in the background. But I think a little too much focus on him gives the game away earlier than it could have. Carfax explains his family was being blackmailed after brother Michael had married a prostitute, Angela. Michael really is missing, having been Murray's assistant, and the blackmailer is the landlord of the pub we saw earlier. While looking for him, Carfax began to help at the mission and is now one of its patrons. This scene nicely confirms and expands on some of the clues that have been hinted at. We return to the pub from the opening scenes, the Angel and Crown, and get another song before Holmes and Watson arrive. This scene is a bit long for my tastes, but that's just personal preference. They engage the blackmailing landlord in conversation about the disappearance of Michael Osborne and Angela Osborne, and are then followed out of the pub and attacked by the landlord's associates, eventually fending them off. This too feels like a bit of filler, as the action scene again goes on a bit too long in order to demonstrate Holmes's capability as a fighter, and really doesn't tell us anything more about the landlord, as he is pretty well established as a thug. We then return to the pawnbroker's shop, now in darkness, and one of the highlights of this film is the contrast between day and night, as we see the same location we saw when Holmes and Watson visited the pawnbroker, yet it looks and feels so much different, so much more threatening. A young woman hides from a copper, played by Patrick Newell, who also played Blessington in The Resident Patient in the Jeremy Brett series, my review of which you can find on my channel. The prostitute then solicits a pair of sailors, only to have them scared off by the same copper. As she leaves, she is attacked and killed. This is the fourth murder in the film, and feels a bit more throwaway than the last one, as we learn virtually nothing about the victim, and it doesn't further the plot. It feels a bit like it's just there for the sake of having another murder. The plot seems to almost struggle with including the murders in the mystery, especially when you consider in the true events this was the first of two murders on the same night, something which could have been used as an acceleration for the plot, but is ignored here. It's almost like the murder is an inconvenience to the story. The next day, Dr. Murray is giving an impassioned speech about poverty being the far worst killer in the East End, and how the Ripper's activities have only served to shine a light on Whitechapel, a Whitechapel that had previously been ignored. The speech is pretty on the money, historically too. Poverty had killed far more than the Ripper ever did, and because the reporting of the killings brought attention to the hideous and dangerous conditions in the poorer parts of London at this time, big social reforms began to happen. So this is entirely historically based. I assume the speech is included to suggest a potential motive for Murray, seeing the murders as a necessary evil to create a catalyst for change, although this isn't explored further. We then see the Prime Minister discussing the matter with the Home Secretary, which includes consulting with Mycroft Holmes and asking him to involve his brother, much to the chagrin of the Home Secretary.
Mr. Mycroft Holmes happens to be one of the most indispensable of all the servants of the crown.
Well, as long as he doesn't bring in his brother Sherlock.
That is precisely what I propose to ask him to do.
Mycroft gets to show off before he goes to see Sherlock, in order to help save the government, something which Holmes is very dismissive of, and rightly so in this situation. This is something accurate to the original stories, as Holmes has very little time for politics, unless his involvement is for the sake of justice. Lestrade arrives with a letter from none other than Jack the Ripper himself, the contents of which are those in the real-life Dear Boss letter, purported to be from the actual murderer, and containing the first mention of Jack the Ripper by name, although the film has used that name several times previously. I think more could have been made of this, had they waited to reveal the name of the Ripper until now, perhaps giving Holmes a vital clue that others missed. As it is, it seems like the killer is using the name he's been given, rather than giving himself the name. Holmes wants the letter published to attempt to stop the killings. Lestrade does not. Holmes goes to see the body of the latest victim, Elizabeth Stride, and is able to give one of Doyle's own theories on the matter, that a man committing the crimes may have disguised himself as a woman.
A woman's shape in the fog could be a man dressed in woman's clothes.
Really, I should hardly think it is likely that Jack the Ripper...
There is no pattern of behavior, Lestrade, in a deranged mind.
The description of how Stride was killed is also reasonably accurate to the real murder, although without the context of the second killing that night doesn't really have any significance. Holmes then attempts to bait Murray with the idea that Michael may be the prime suspect, and watches for a reaction, which he doesn't get. Mycroft returns to Baker Street, and Morley really puts on a powerful performance as he attempts to rouse Sherlock into more action.
Of course, I blame myself. I should have refused the Prime Minister's request to call in my brother. In any case, he was already engaged with what was out. Stalemate. I should have realized there was only one person who was capable of solving this problem.
Once he's gone, Holmes is roused into action, as he and Watson take to the streets and try and catch the Ripper in the act. With the way the film has been portraying the murders, this seems a a bit like Too Little Too Late. If his only plan is to hang around Whitechapel and hope to catch the murderer, he surely could have done that a few killings ago, if that's the best he has, as a plan. A few streets away from where Holmes and Watson are patrolling, a woman calls from a window to a man on the street below. She beckons him in, but is soon to discover it's the Ripper. Holmes hears the screams and sends Watson for the police as he attempts to chase down the location of said screams. He arrives at the mortuary and is attacked by the Ripper, who escapes. Holmes then arrives at the mission where Carfax is helping out, and Sally arrives soon after, and Holmes demands to see Murray. Murray is sleeping, and Holmes wakes him and further presses him on Michael. He reveals he knows the landlord and Michael's wife were working together to blackmail the family. Murray explains Michael found out about the plan and refused to take part and was attacked by the landlord. In the scuffle, Angela was splashed with acid, burning her face. Murray revealed that Michael survived, but now has brain damage and has been assisting Murray with menial work ever since.
Well, this is how he's been since that night.
This pretty much concludes the Michael subplot, and also concludes the most consistent section of the film, as it rushes to tie up all the loose ends. A policeman comes to collect Murray, and he and Holmes meet Watson and Lestrade at the horrific scene of the latest killing, which was the most brutal of all the Ripper murders, and demonstrated an escalation of violence rarely seen. Within the plot of this film, though, the escalation doesn't happen, as the brutality of the murders varies from victim to victim. It's a shame they didn't follow that element of the real crimes, as it would have tied into this film's resolution. Holmes takes Watson to the pub, where they demand the landlord take them to see the real owner of the pub, Angela Osborne. She now hides away from public view, and it was her that sent the case of surgical instruments that sort of got him involved in the case, although he already was involved. She also reveals her disfigurement to them, and Watson has an unusual reaction for a doctor that I understand why they did, but it does diminish his character further.
The woman with the ugliest face in the world. Want to see?
She then says that Michael was the one who had come up with the blackmail scheme and disfigured her in anger, but Holmes doesn't believe her version of events. This is all a bit confused, as it seems like she would be the more reliable witness, the other version of events coming second hand from Murray, and the only reason to have this scene is to introduce Angela as a character for the finale, which is a bit late in the game for me. It would have been better had they attempted to make her somewhat sympathetic. Had she engaged Holmes in the case because she cared about prostitutes, having got out of the business, even if it was through illicit means, and then paid a price, instead of making her madam who hates all women because of her disfigurement. It would have been far less cliched, as she doesn't really have a reason for sending the surgical kit to Holmes. Holmes takes Michael to his father, and his father is equally dismissive of Michael, unwilling to see him until Holmes reveals his condition, which quickly changes his opinion and attempts to make the Duke sympathetic in the way the script did not allow for Angela.
Have Michael put into his old room.
Of course.
Do it yourself, Edward. It's better, not the servants. And tell him I shall come and see him presently.
As Holmes and Watson leave the Duke, Watson knows Holmes has worked out who the Ripper is, but Holmes requires proof, and has set a trap for that night. At the Angel and Crown, a figure skulks behind patrolling police and makes his way inside to Angela's bedroom as he prepares to stab her.
Good evening, Lord Carfax.
Holmes revealed Angela's location to the Duke within earshot of Carfax in order to bait the trap to catch him. They struggle, and an upturned lamp sets the room ablaze as Angela watches on. The struggle continues as the landlord rescues Angela. It doesn't appear as if Holmes had told Angela what he was up to. Had she at the very least agreed to the plan, it wouldn't make Holmes look like such a jerk. Eventually, Holmes knocks Carfax into the fire, presumably killing him, and we fade to Holmes and Watson back at Baker Street, where Holmes eventually reveals how he knew it was Carfax, which is honestly as spurious as his first deduction.
The writer described his murders as his work. I love my work. I want to get to work right away. If his gruesome activity was, as he said it was, his work, he was obviously a man of means who had no need of ordinary employment.
The idea that the use of the word work gave it away is very thin, especially when the opportunity to seed clues throughout the plot was there. His reason for keeping it from the police is also very uncharacteristic for Holmes and could have been better developed. The film ends with Holmes receiving a hat from Nottingham, and we get the deduction he used in the Blue Carbuncle. You might not think so based on my review, but I actually do enjoy this film. Perhaps because of the novelty of the idea and the few good things that are in there, but I also don't think it's a good film. It's not a good Sherlock film, and it's not a good Jack the Ripper film, but I have to give it credit for coming up with its own original suspect for Jack. It seems, though, like there are simple changes they could have made to make it a really great film. If it were me, I would have better integrated the real murders and real events, while still feeling free to take liberties in this entirely fictional account. I also would have involved Watson more in the story, perhaps also championing Murray's cause, but in a positive way. But as it is, the story has its problems, and therefore isn't really the best. We'll have to wait to see what the next Jack the Ripper versus Sherlock Holmes story can provide. Thank you. Goodbye.